My name is Alyssa, and 3 years ago, I married Steve, a man I thought I knew inside and out. We both worked at the same company, climbing the corporate ladder together. Steve was charming, persistent, and relentless in his pursuit of me when we first met. It wasn't long before I found myself falling for him, caught up in the whirlwind romance he offered. We moved quickly, dating, engagement, and then marriage, all within the span of a year. At first, everything seemed perfect. We had a spacious apartment, a stable income, and dreams of building a family. I traveled frequently for work, often taking long trips overseas. Steve, on the other hand, worked in the same company, but his role required him to stay local. I trusted him completely, and I felt lucky to have a husband who supported my career. Our plan was simple. I handled the day-to-day expenses and household costs, while Steve took care of our savings. We were supposed to be working toward the same future, together. But cracks started to show, small and barely noticeable at first, until they began to widen. Steve and I had talked about having children, and while I wanted to start a family in my 20s, Steve wasn't in a rush. He assured me that we had time, that we could focus on ourselves for a little while longer. His reluctance frustrated me, but I told myself it was just a phase. After all, we had only been married for a few years. I tried to be patient, even as the doubts in the back of my mind started to grow louder. Then there was his family, his parents, in particular. They were always a point of tension between us. From the start, they had lived with Steve's sister, but over time, the relationship with their daughter and her husband soured. Steve's sister didn't want to take care of their parents full-time, and eventually, her husband put his foot down, forcing them to leave. That's when my in-laws turned their attention to us. Steve assured me they wouldn't impose on us, but I knew better. His parents were overbearing, selfish, and had a way of inserting themselves into our lives whether we wanted them to or not. The tension built quietly, like a pressure cooker, until everything finally exploded. It all began during a routine business trip. I was away for 2 weeks, as usual, and while I missed Steve, I trusted that everything was fine back home. We stayed in touch, exchanging brief messages like we always did. But toward the end of my trip, Steve stopped responding. I messaged him several times, small notes to say I missed him and that I'd be home soon, but he left them unread. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself he was just busy with work, or maybe he was out with friends. But deep down, a sense of unease began to creep in. Steve always responded, even if it was just a quick okay or see you soon. His silence felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I finally arrived back home, I was exhausted from the flight. I had expected Steve to pick me up at the airport, like he always did, but there was no sign of him. I waited for nearly an hour before finally giving up and taking a taxi. By the time I reached our apartment building, frustration and worry were gnawing at me. As I stepped out of the elevator onto our floor, I saw a familiar figure, Steve's mother, standing outside our apartment, chatting with a neighbor as if she belonged there. My stomach churned. "Mother?" I called out, approaching her. She turned to face me with a wide smile. "Oh, Alyssa, you're back," she said, her tone casual, almost too casual. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've moved in," she replied, her smile unwavering. I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "What do you mean you've moved in?" Ignoring my question, she turned away and entered the apartment, leaving me standing there in shock. I followed her inside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the living room, the sound of laughter greeted me. Steve was sitting on the couch with his father, both of them looking far too comfortable. When they saw me, the laughter died, replaced by a heavy silence. "Steve," I said, my voice tight. "What's going on?" He looked at me sheepishly, as if caught in a lie. "Oh, hey, Alyssa. You're back earlier than I thought." "I told you when I'd be home," I replied, my frustration bubbling over. "Why didn't you pick me up from the airport?" Steve's father interrupted before he could answer. "We're having a family gathering," he said, his tone dismissive. "Could you step out for a bit? This is a private event." I stared at him, stunned. "Excuse me? This is my home." His father waved a hand dismissively. Yes, but we're family, and we'd appreciate some privacy. I looked to Steve, expecting him to defend me, to tell his father that I was his wife and this was our home. But instead, he just sat there, silent and complicit. Alyssa, maybe you should go out for a little while, Steve finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. After everything we had been through, after all the sacrifices I had made for our marriage, he was choosing them over me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet as the reality of the situation settled in. His parents had moved in without my knowledge or consent, and Steve had let it happen. I stood there, staring at the three of them, feeling like a stranger in my own home. They wanted me out, like I was the intruder, the outsider, but I wasn't going to let them push me aside so easily. This is my apartment, I said, my voice cold and steady, and I'm not leaving. The room fell silent. Steve's parents exchanged confused glances, clearly unaware that the apartment was in my name. Steve squirmed uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet my eyes. His mother was the first to recover. Well then, she said, her tone turning sharp. Maybe it's time we change that. After all, Steve works just as hard as you do. Shouldn't he be the owner of the apartment? Steve, emboldened by his parents' presence, nodded. Yeah, Alyssa. Maybe we should transfer the apartment to my name. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. Was this really happening? The man I had loved and trusted was trying to take everything from me, and his parents were cheering him on. I realized then that I had been blind to the truth. Steve had always put his parents first, and I had been nothing more than a convenience, someone to support him financially while he followed their lead. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Fine, I said, surprising them all. Let's get divorced. Steve's eyes widened in shock. What? You heard me, I said. You want the apartment? Fine, but we're done. I'll sign the divorce papers and you can have everything. For a moment, Steve seemed at a loss for words. His parents, however, jumped at the opportunity. That's the best idea I've heard all day, his father said, grinning. Let's end this and move on. Steve hesitated, glancing between me and his parents. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, but it didn't take long for him to come to a decision. Okay, he said, his voice steady. Let's do it. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. This was it. The end of a marriage that had been crumbling for longer than I had realized. I had been holding on to a fantasy, to the idea that we could still build the life we had dreamed of, but that dream was dead. However, before I walked away, I had one last card to play. I had suspected for a while that something wasn't right with Steve, that there was more to his distance than just his parents. That's why, months ago, I had installed hidden cameras in the apartment. I wanted to protect myself in case things took a darker turn, and they had. I'll sign the divorce papers, I said, keeping my tone calm. But I have one condition. Steve frowned. What condition? I want the joint savings, I said. Half of it belongs to me, and I want it now. Steve's parents began to protest, but I silenced them with a look. And before you argue, I continued, I have evidence of everything, including the fact that you've been having an affair. The room went silent, Steve's face drained of color. I saw the shoes at the door, I said, my voice low. They weren't your mother's, and when I came home that day, there was someone else in the apartment, wasn't there? Steve stammered, trying to deny it, but I wasn't done. The cameras caught everything, I said. Your affair, your parents covering for you, all of it. I could take this to HR at the company, but I won't. Not if you give me my share of the savings and sign the divorce papers. Steve's face crumpled in defeat. He knew I had him cornered. There was no way out. Fine, he muttered. You'll get your money. I nodded, satisfied. Good. The divorce went through quickly after that. I got my share of the savings, and I handed over the apartment to Steve and his parents. They could have it. I didn't need it anymore. A few months later, I received a call from Steve. He sounded desperate, asking for money to cover the rent, which he hadn't realized was $2,000 a month. I refused, reminding him that he had wanted the apartment, and now it was his responsibility. Steve's affair partner, a woman from our company, had left him not long after the divorce. She realized too late that Steve wasn't the prize she thought he was. He and his parents were left to struggle on their own, and I moved on with my life. I accepted a promotion that took me overseas, leaving the mess behind. The freedom was exhilarating. I met someone new, a kind man who truly valued me, and I finally felt the peace I had been searching for. Looking back, I realized how blind I had been. I had thought I could build a life with Steve, but in the end, he was never truly on my side. His loyalty had always been with his parents, Zrinia, and I had been the outsider from the very beginning. But now I was free, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe.